Redmi Turbo 4 was introduced with MediaTek's latest mid-range chipset, the Dimensity 8400. This phone will probably enter the global market under the name Poco X7 Pro. And its design is as you can see. How many designers did Xiaomi not have to make this phone look like the iPhone 16? This phone has a relatively large 6.67-inch screen with more bezels than the previous generation, which is AMOLED and supports 68 billion colors, Dolby Vision, HDR10+, and these things. It has an optical fingerprint under the screen. The resolution of the screen is 2712 in 1220 pixels and 120 Hz, which is great for games and watching movies in its price range. Also, the brightness of this phone's screen reaches 400 nits, according to Xiaomi, which is really good for a cheap phone. The body of this phone is probably plastic and will come in different colors such as green, white, and black, and it also supports IP68 certification. The software of this phone is HyperOS 2 with Android 15, which is much smoother than previous HyperOS 1. The hardware of this phone includes the Dimensity 8400 chipset, which is based on TSMC 4nm lithography, along with 12 to 16 GB of RAM and UFS 4 hard drive. What MediaTek did for this phone is to replace all the cores of this phone with Cortex A725 with different frequencies, which made this phone much better in multi-core section. The Antutu benchmark of this chipset is 1.8 million. This phone plays games and is almost better than the 8 Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 and almost the 8 Gen 3 in game performance. However, the single core benchmark of this phone is only 7% better than the 8 Plus Gen 1, which make it less effective in CPU intensive games like PUBG and PvP and custom rooms of CODEM. Instead, it has much stronger graphics that help it in games like Genshin and run these heavy games with very high frame rate. The single core benchmark of this phone is 1600 and the multi-core is 6500. Overall, this chipset has improved a lot in the multi-core and graphic processor section, which is useful for games like Genshin Impact and Wuthering Wave. The next part, which is always a weakness of a budget and affordable phones, is the camera, where Xiaomi has put the 50 and 8 megapixel cameras. The main camera has a relatively good sensor that gets the job done and is good for its price. But on the other hand, it also has a crappy 8 megapixel ultra-wide lens that Xiaomi always puts and use in other phones. Overall, this phone's camera is a main lens, so if you prioritize the camera, don't go for it at all. There is a 20 megapixel lens on the front panel, which is also ordinary, and it shoots 1080p video with 30 fps, just like phones from 10 years ago. The attractive part of this phone for gamers is the giant silicon carbon battery of this phone, which has a capacity of 6550 mAh battery in the China and India region and probably 6000 mAh on Poco phones globally, along with a 90 watt fast charge. The battery life of this phone is not very long due to its high power chipset, but it's much better than the previous generation phones. But it still doesn't reach the performance and battery life of the Snapdragon 8 Elite. The price of this phone ranges from $275 to $340, depending on the memory and RAM.